Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 36th episode of Retuning Your Firm. For those of you who haven't been on the show before, why is it retuning? Well, because if you're in a race, and we're all in a race in a way, world is competitive, and your car is denied access to the track, so it goes into the pit, what do? Do you cover it with a tarpaulin or do you retune it? Hopefully you choose the latter route, but we know that not everybody does. It's Retuning Your Firm. Thank you very much to LBS for that great insight. So what are we going to talk about today? What are today's themes? We're going to do a poll on new technologies, and it's the interface of new technologies and your business model, which to me is always a really interesting place to focus on. So we'll try and get some thoughts around where you feel about that. Delighted to have Sue Vinnicombe, who is the, I'd say almost like the author of the whole notion of women in leadership, a professor of women and leadership, but she has been very much driving an agenda that so many people take for granted, but believe me, 30 years ago was not the case. And a new area, biometric intelligence. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're using health, you're using AI, you're using a lot of other techniques to look at ways to keep people safe once we go back to the office. I'll be hearing from Pete about that. So who's on the panel today? As I said, Pete will be talking about what that means in practice and how management can actually sort of start thinking about how we're going to be managing that aspect when people that may be coming to the office that we possibly aren't sure what they're bringing with them, apart from work, obviously. Sue Vinnicombe, who's the Professor of Women in Leadership at the Cranfield School of Management, and our anchor tenant, Francesca Lagerberg, who is the Global Leader Network Capabilities at Grant Thornton International. And she was saying that with great pride, this is the 35th episode that she has joined me on. So I'm afraid I've done all 36, but hey, that's another story. But anyway, it's been lovely to have you, Francesca, and I don't think either of us thought that it was remotely possible 9-10 months ago, back in March, pre the first lockdown, when we ran the first episode, that we'd still be here 9 months on in the third lockdown. But life does strange things. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, let's just go back and refresh what are these 7 strategies for retuning your firm. I kind of go through this slide every week, so I know some of you will find it a little bit, I've heard it all before, make yourself a coffee quick, but actually I think it is quite important to set the scene. So first of all, think big. Lewis Carroll, are you believing 6 impossible things before breakfast? If you're not, then you're probably missing out. Also think small. What are the angles that are going to resonate with your key audiences? So what makes you special is a question that a lot of firms find it quite hard to differentiate themselves, so just keep that in mind always. Remember that when it comes to relationships, it's not about having an address book, CRM system. It's about reciprocity. It's about favors. It's about actually people helping each other. I think that's really important. And that's the way your power comes from. It's about influence, not about the ability, as any managing partner would know, to be able to tell people what to do unless there's an emergency of some sort. Mostly it's about collaboratively working together and the power of the relationships involved. Think about campaigns. Think about actually working with your clients and your people as well, because what you really want to do is to be thinking of the people you're working with as a community, not as a one-off audience. This show's interesting because obviously it started off as a one-off audience. Lots of people I know who are now in their 20th time they've joined in, which is amazing. I think we're a community. I really do. Let's drop convention. I know that people will feel, particularly the lawyers possibly, that convention is there for a good reason, and I can't disagree with them, but you've really got to go for the new ideas and the new services as well. And as we'll see in the tech poll shortly, where you're on that spectrum, be interesting to see. Speed is of the essence. What's interesting, I suppose, is that because, put it this way, firms had 3 years of development in about 3 weeks a few months ago. But it was mostly, it wasn't very systemic. I think that's probably the best way to put it. It was kind of knee-jerk. Okay, let's just do it. Do make sure you have a process, because otherwise your innovation ideas will be stifled, believe me. But if you've got a process and a system that actually helps you, then people are going to be more relaxed about sustaining that culture of innovation, which is actually so critical to the future profitability of your business. And be entrepreneurial. Keep listening and innovating. And I always say the key word in that sentence is listening. If you're not listening to your clients, if you're not listening to your people, you will be probably in a suboptimal place. Go back to the racetrack, you won't win the race. And at worst, you might crash. So just remember that you're always listening. 2 ears, 1 mouth, that ratio. And I wanted to thank Elena Kudsko of Globsec of Bratislava back in April 2020. And I just love those 7 strategies. So I will keep using them if I may. My apologies for that. So let's talk a little bit about what the forum's up to, taking a second there. There's a couple of roundtables coming up in the next couple of weeks. On Tuesday, we've got the strategy and marketing group looking at the whole area of common data standards. And what have marketing and data got in common? Well, the answer is rather a lot, because if you're trying to actually do anything with clients and the data's all unstructured, it's that much harder. And then for the managing partners, and again, those of you who aren't familiar with our firm-wide leader roundtables, what are the sort of reflections on strategic and leadership patterns? And Julia, who was on this show last week, is coming to talk a bit more with a colleague, Kate Lai, around that area in terms of what is actually the client saying around this whole area of leadership. So I think that'll be really interesting. Managing Partners Forum awards, amazing. Now live submissions open until the 26th of February. As of like yesterday, I think we went live, so that's really exciting. And I think it's really important this year that as many firms as possible enter, because if there's been a year in which management's existential contribution to the business has been brought into very sharp focus, it's been the pandemic year. I have this expression BC standing for before COVID, and I do think in management terms that's a reality, because what we did before and what we do now is very different, and those firms that have risen to it have got something not to celebrate. We used to call it celebrating. This is recognizing. This is recognizing your contribution. And all too often, for the people in the front line who possibly think that it's their technical skills that win the work and nothing else, and there are still some of those, the idea that management's contribution should be recognized, I think, is something that we continue to do. The sad thing is it's our 19th annual awards, and unfortunately we've still got the same message. So sadly, probably a little bit like Sue will talk about lately, it's a constant journey, not a state. And this is something that we believe in a year's time we'll also be still encouraging firms to recognize you, the audience, effectively, because that's who you are, your contribution to the business. Sadly, it isn't always recognized back at the ranch. And again, Julia Hoho's picture again, but if you haven't already done so, there are 77 now 5-minute videos. All the ones going back to March are now there. They're all there. And so you can go and check them out. They last 5 minutes typically. But that's a really good way to just kind of actually catch up with, particularly if you missed any of the episodes that we've had today. So that's a little bit about the forum. A big swipe of swoop. Just wanted to give you a sort of another quick heads up that on the 17th of March, there will be an email going out very shortly. We're holding a flagship conference as part of the project that we've been involved in for the last couple of years, working with 4 business schools. And what we're looking at is the whole area of design sprints, and in particular how using design sprint can fast track innovation. Going back to what I said a bit earlier about a need for a system, this is a really good system for innovation. Thoroughly recommended. So this is sort of for CEOs, C-suite people, and again, we'll be going out in the next few days with a really strong program, I think. So hopefully put that in your diary. 17th of March, 2 o'clock till 4. So nice, tight, and about 15 or 20 speakers. So that's good. So go back on that. So today, just to kind of remind people who haven't done them before, the next session of the today's show is a poll, and this is your chance to contribute and to then get feedback from what you and your peers feel on a topical issue. And it isn't just internal. Government uses it, as you can see in that quote. The House of Lords used it in a recent report on the UK-EU relationship. I don't think anybody was listening to them, sadly, but that's another story. But we certainly got a mention in the report, which was helpful. And I think I'm correct in saying it was the only independent data that was used in that report. Everything else was government stats. So that was quite positive. So these polls that you do are not just, Friday morning. They actually do have a much bigger audience. So please contribute. That's all I'm saying. And they are anonymous. But let's go back to last week. What came out? This is fascinating. This is the level of activity. I think I said last week, for those who are on the show, look, gosh, it looks like people are feeling much more positive. I hadn't realized quite the extent. I mean, this is really, to me, really quite dramatic, because if you go back to February, Boris Bounce territory, 80 played 6 in terms of expansion to contraction. Last week, we had over 70 plays 10. They're not that far apart, and there's lots of stuff in the middle, but okay, expansion could be you're at 6%, you're expanding to 7%. So what are the numbers doing? That's really the next question. Well, again, the same sort of situation. The none, the blue bit, is now over 50%. Go back to April, and the purple bit, which is the over 30% dip, was over 50%. So there's a sea change of attitudes to what sort of income. And we had PwC last week talking and saying they're very much seeing the same message, that people are surprised at how the extent to which their income has held up. I hope everybody on the call is in that good place, obviously. Picking up some of these other charts, again, very similar mixed picture around new work. That was kind of, nobody was quite sure whether it was going to grow or expand over the last few months. And there was a period in end of August when it really went in a funny way. Whether that was a rogue poll, I'm not sure. But anyway, there's clearly now a trend. And the same, and this is really to me quite heartening, headcount, because today is all about people as always, that having gone from 60 down, 60 plays 8, right down into as low as 10% people expecting to expand their headcount back in end of April, it's now creeping up. It's not obviously quite as high as the other two, but it's definitely a big, and only 6% looking to contract their headcount. So stability. Now, let's see if that's realistic. This is far too busy to even begin to show you today, so I apologize, particularly if you're looking on a phone or something like that. But I think the key message here is that the two ones that were the sort of one here, the sort of purpley one, and the green one, those two are at the same now as they were back in February. And those are respectively develop a clear purpose and strategy and develop your people skills and capabilities. There's lots of stuff that's come up and down in the meantime, but the underlying two core priorities are the same as a year ago. That was a bit of a surprise to me, but it's, again, it shows that firms have got their strategy broadly right, albeit maybe through some choppy seas over the last 12 months. They're still back to where they think is the right place, which is clear purpose, strategy, people skills. And I can relate to that strongly. What's getting in the way? Well, there are two here, which, to be honest, one of them didn't even exist back in February, which was the one that's now come through the highest, which is the financial health of your client base. Because if your clients aren't going to pay you, they're not going to instruct you. So that's not good news. And I don't think that's one yet's worked through, to be perfectly honest. And then the other one is the poor economic outlook. That was there before at 30%. It's now a lot higher, went up to over 80% a couple of months ago. So the rest will kind of jiggle and jaggle, but those two, I think, really do actually fall through. Now, are they sufficiently big constraints to prevent people seeing expansion in revenues? I'm not sure. I suspect yes is probably the answer. The jury's out on that one, obviously. What about what matters when partners are having their conversations? We've only been running this one since August. Finance and cash flow, absolutely top of the pack, straight line almost. But look at marketing, the green one, quite interesting. It was in the pack, actually come end of October, it actually equaled finance, and it's not far behind now. Whereas things like clients, which is the sort of the brown one, that's kind of, coming back a bit, but it's dipped down. Everything to do with operational performance. Brexit, is that getting a mention? Not really, etc. So there's quite a lot of interesting things. Brexit is now coming up quite strongly from December to Jan. That one I would pick up, the orange one. But there's quite a lot of, there's clearly what people are talking about is the money and the marketing. And of course, the marketing community love that because the first time ever, they're popular. Well, that's not strictly true, but certainly they've gone up the pecking order a bit. And what's true of the statements of this firm? Well, again, Andrew Kakabadze, who is wonderful guy from Henley, he was saying these are amazingly good results for any sector. He said, I know we might want to do better, but getting into sort of 70, 80, 90% around things like leaders sharing options, employees being valued, leaders being transparent, leaders being accessible is, he said, no other sector gets those sort of numbers. So, I'm not saying pat on the back, but clearly we are getting some things right if that's the way that people see their firms. What about, these are the two that haven't shifted much, interestingly. So people working from home, there's a very small thing right at the bottom, which is called no one. In other words, everybody's going to be back in the office, brackets not. And there's a blue thing at the top where everyone's going to be working from home. And then the others kind of fit in between the middle. Again, it's a bit hard to say, but I would think most people are going to find it very hard to hire anyone who isn't going to be offered a certain amount of time working from home looking into the future. So very quickly that will translate into these virtual workplaces. I think that's going to be likely a permanent change brought on by the pandemic. What's the consequence? Well, lots, but one of them, obviously the obvious one, is the space requirements. Hasn't fundamentally shifted since April. It's exactly zigzags a bit, but basically there's a bunch of firms that say about the same, and there's a bunch say 20% less, and there's a little bit in between, not much. So it's a bit of a binary one, that one. So today's poll. What we're going to do today is I'm going to ask you to answer some questions regarding new technologies. First of all, a bit about the relative importance of people and tech in your business model. And it's kind of a spectrum, that one. What's changed over the past few years, and also what is likely to change over the next 3? What are some of the drivers and barriers to change? What about what types of tech are you using? I'm not talking here about I use Microsoft Zinc. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying what type of technology, what uses are you using them for? And again, what are the drivers and barriers to investment in new tech? So that's the poll. Okay, I'll just go through them so that everybody can kind of see. Hopefully, you can see them. So, where would you currently position your firm on the following spectrum? Ranging from essentially everything is dependent on our human experts. That gets 20%. 50% with a 4, 26% with a 3, nobody at a 2, and nobody at a depends primarily on delivering content through proprietary online systems, which is our brave new world, according to some pundits. So at this stage, currently, you're mostly at a 4. And if I'm looking 3 years out, which is a kind of a typical strategy perspective, nobody's at 0. There's a little group, 24% of you who've gone into 2, but the bulk of you now have moved from 4 to 3. And so there's clearly movement, but it's not extreme rapid movement. There's only movement from the wholly depending primarily on the people to also depending on the system. So that's fair enough. In terms of what are the things that have changed most, the one that comes through quite strongly is the technologies used to deliver services. And if I can see, what's the second one down there? There's quite a drop then. The next one is how you deliver services to clients, but there's quite a strong one around deliveries you use to deliver services. Which are the ones that are going to change? Again, there's slightly more of a movement there. How you deliver services and the ones you use to deliver services, they're fundamentally the same. Those are the two which come out quite strongly, 50%. Moving on down, what are the drivers of change? Responding to the demands, that's hitting 68% of existing clients. That probably isn't a great surprise, but there's quite a few clustered around there. There's no obvious key driver there. There's quite a few clustered. Number 6, again, I'm afraid this is the one where they let me down, but it's very, very clear from that lack of time, we're too busy to focus on change is the one that comes through quite strongly. And in second place, there's really spread around after that, to be perfectly honest. What types of tech are actually being used? The main one there is speeding up of tasks. So it's machine learning, if you like. It's not really artificial intelligence. It's just we're speeding up tasks through using the tech, and that possibly isn't a great surprise. Where are you going to be investing? You're going to be investing more around substituting routinely performed tasks previously undertaken by people. That comes through again. Speeding up still there in second, with reducing the cost. But the other one, which was there as well, if you're looking at number 7, 50%, so it's not very far away. So that's the key driver, I think, on that one. What are the sort of most important drivers? And it's mainly around efficiency. That's 82%. That's very strong. And what are the barriers? Again, time kicks in very strongly on there. So I think that's probably the sort of feedback we've had from the poll today, which I think is really interesting. So I'd now like to stop sharing the poll and also stop sharing myself and invite Pete to come and give us his thoughts as to his area of expertise and any thoughts he may have on the poll. He's very happy to cover as well.
Thanks, Richard, and hello to everybody. My name's Pete Grzonka. I'm born in London, lived in London, but I actually live over in Cardiff now with my wife and 3 children. I have a history of working in professional sport for 15 to 20 years, where I was commercial director at various different sports clubs. I then went to running a sports events business. It probably won't surprise you to hear that sports events and COVID-19 didn't make for the happiest of bedfellows. So in March, my business basically fell off a cliff. And as is now being seen as an opportunity to pivot, as people seem to refer to it these days, I've been working for the last 7 or 8 months with a technology called Tested.me. It's being developed essentially to help businesses manage their COVID safety for, first of all, their workplaces, but also their employees. I think it was really interesting to see some of the feedback in the survey that Richard put over earlier. When asked about when people would be working from the office and working from home, it was pretty clear that pretty well 100% of people did not anticipate that they would be coming back to the office 100% of the time. However, whilst a fifth of them said they would be entirely home working, the remaining 80% of people said that it would be actually the office would be forming a part of their working space in the future. During our conversations with businesses, which have been from all sorts of different industries, this has really been hammered home to us, and that the future way of working is definitely a blend of home working and office working, with benefits coming from both, really. I was certainly quickly made aware, even in the same organisations, that attitudes to kind of working from home varied massively. I spoke to a number of people from a London-based law firm. One of them was a senior partner who was thoroughly enjoying working from home. He had no commute. He had a spare room in his lovely large house that he converted into an office, and was certainly enjoying the headspace and thinking time that being out of the office gave him. He had his network of clients sorted out. He was well established and he knew everyone in the company. Equally, I spoke to a trainee solicitor of the same firm who was living in a flat in Southfields with 4 other people. He'd gone from working long hours in a vibrant office with a couple of hours of post-work entertainment and socialising around the to sharing domestic Wi-Fi and a kitchen table with 4 other people. To say he wasn't keen to get back to the office would be an understatement. So as I say, the conclusion is the future of work is going to be a balance between allowing people to work in the office place and allowing people to work from home. And if you're not offering this, you really aren't going to be able to recruit new people. Again, I've spoken to a number of my friends who've started new jobs during the pandemic. And they've really found that the ability to do a bit of both is going to be great in the future. Some of the downsides of working 100% of home is that they had no feeling of the cult, or they had a less of a feeling of the culture of a business, and also how various different people in the business kind of fit together. So they're certainly looking forward to kind of getting back, even though they've started from 100% working remotely. So this leads you to kind of where we sit. If you've got people in a pandemic who are sat working at home and they feel nice and safe, and they're basically saying that 80% of them aren't going to carry on 100% working from home, at some point you're going to have to get people back together. You get collaborative working is definitely works better in the office, and so does innovation. So to get people back together, how do you bring them back in an environment where they feel safe? And with this, we're using a technology that Richard mentioned earlier. Incorporates biometrics. Essentially, we start from a position where each individual employee has a biometric account, like a digital passport. We verify their identity, and from them, they then report various different things on a daily basis. So how they're feeling, whether or not they've had a test, whether or not they've had a vaccine going forward, how they're feeling from a health from a wellness point of view, so that when they come back into these shared workspaces, that everybody knows that they're coming from an environment where everybody's ticked the same box. I don't think you can underestimate the worry that employees have of getting back into a shared workspace. Some of the learnings that we've had from dealing with some of our businesses is whilst homework has definitely had lots of benefits, around 18% of people have said that enforced home working has had a negative impact on their mental health. This has led to a shift which hopefully is going to be here to stay post-COVID, as businesses take a more active role in managing employees' health and wellness. Technology can be here to provide an indicator of wellness and happiness of your staff. For example, we ask a simple daily question of how employees are feeling. This allows organisations to see trends within their staff, but also get insights into things like how happiness is different between home workers and office workers. One of the main upsides of office working is the ability to share information. And again, we've learned from some of our staff how they're using this to collaborate online and recreate some of the things which an office does create for them. We've dealt with a large accountancy firm who've a regular intake of graduates each year. They spent the majority of time working from home, and as they've spent the time doing that, they've been exposed to a lot more online learning courses. Despite this, when they're benchmarks, they found that they were behind previous year's intakes in certain areas. It's the organic trickle down of knowledge from senior partners to the rest of the firm that has a massive benefit. Many of the professionals I've spoken to cited that seeing how a senior partner acts with clients is probably more important than the content of the meetings itself. To mitigate this, we work with companies who are instigating online mentoring and shadowing to ensure that employees share knowledge and people also have a greater understanding of what their co-workers do. This kind of environment is also fantastic for knowledge sharing. I recently took part in an online session arranged for the staff of the firm I mentioned above. It was held at lunchtime, and it was apparent that people dropped in on an informal basis, often with sandwiches in hand. The speakers are on different topics. It gives them both internal and invited guests. The host kept people on their toes by asking some questions, and it really did give a good opportunity for people to come together and kind of learn from that. I do think an important thing, though, is not only creating collaborative spaces or trying to recreate that, because hopefully in the future, when people get back into the office, they'll have that as part of their working space. It is important that managers take time to actually take time one-to-one with people and spend some time actually looking at things that aren't formal work and really spend time kind of understanding their staff. It's clear that firms will need to offer both home and office-based solutions in the future. If we continue to be unprecedented times at the moment, and whilst the pandemic is not going to disappear, we've distributed 3 million vaccines and rapid testing is becoming more and more available. So hopefully it's possible to see light at the end of the tunnel. We've all been forced to operate from home more than the office over the last 9 months. And it's important when we are allowed by the government that we encourage employees that want to get back into the office, but also give them the flexibility to do both. As I mentioned earlier, anxiety of employees coming back into the office, really shouldn't be underestimated. And I'm sure a lot of work's been done in your firms to install a number of physical measures to ensure that people feel safe. If you want to speak to us about how technology can help, then please, Richard will have my details, and we'd be happy to have a discussion further.
Thanks very much, Pete. That was really interesting, and I think it's picked up a number of themes that we've picked up. People are very apprehensive about going back to the office, and it's got to be a safe place, otherwise you're not really doing the right thing by your staff. So thank you for sharing those key messages. I'd like to invite Sue to come and share the stage now, if that's the right terminology, and tell us a little bit about her journey, I think, and then where she thinks it's at, and some of the key drivers and targets that she thinks we should all be reflecting on into the future.
Thank you very much, Richard, for inviting me on this morning to talk about my favourite topic. As Richard indicated, I've been doing this for a very long time. My background basically is I've always worked in the whole area of research around gender and management. And it was around about 23 years ago that I thought, well, we now actually do have a lot of women coming into big companies in quite significant numbers, and yet we're not seeing them in serious leadership positions. And so I decided that's where I wanted to focus, set up a research centre, and as a bit of a kind of a marker, a bit like Richard does his tracker, we said, well, let's have a look at how many women there are on the top FTSE boards. Just to give you a feel for where we've got to today, I will tell you that back in 1999, there was 6.7% women on the FTSE 100 board. So we have come a long way, as they say. So when, it got to 2010, and if you remember, this takes you back a bit, Viviane Reding in the EU stood up and said, this is quite appalling. We're not seeing women on boards. And she was wanting to introduce a mandatory 40% quota for women on boards across the EU. And the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, said he was very opposed to this. He set up the Lord Davis Independent Review of Women on Boards. I was invited as an academic expert onto that steering committee to decide what we should do. And just really, basically, the outcome of that was that we decided to go for targets. So what I want to talk about in my little slot here is a quick overview of the progress, and then to have a look particularly at how companies and firms are using targets, because some of you may not know, but actually we are the only major country in the world to have actually used targets and not quotas to actually advance the number of women in leadership. And I think around that time, it was felt that, are you going to go for quotas, which were kind of mandatory, targets, or are you going to go for a kind of a more voluntary target approach? And I remember being sold on the idea of doing targets from senior chairmen saying to me, what quotas does is changes the numbers. Targets really changes the culture of the organisation. I thought that's absolutely right. Well, I'll have some thoughts on that later on. So that's why I want to talk to you about targets. But coming back to Women on Board, just giving you a quick feel as to how far we've got. As I said, back then, 22 years ago, we were just under 7% women on FTSE 100 boards. Well, if we look at it right now, we produced our report at the end of September 2020. We're at 35% women on FTSE 100 boards and 33% on FTSE 250. So we have made, really phenomenal progress. If you look at it, quickly over the last few years. Since 2010, when Lord Davis came in, we were at 12.5%. So we've come up, tremendously, 200% since then. There's always a but. Academics are never fully happy with the progress that's been made. And my two buts are this. One, and I'm sure a number of you recognise this within your own businesses, that we've still made very, very little progress on women into executive directorships. So if we just look at FTSE 100, we made a bit of progress this past year. We are at 13%, but we've still only got 5 women CEOs as at the time of our report. I think it's gone up to about 7 now, but it's really tiny. So why is it that, women are not moving into executive directorship posts? What is it we've got to do within our businesses to really develop the women up? They definitely come in at the start, but they don't come up the pipeline. And perhaps the other even bigger but is it's very interesting, as I've said, we've got now huge numbers of women in non-executive directorships across our top FTSE companies, but very few women in influential roles. So if you take the chair role, at the time of our report in September, only 8 women on FTSE 100 boards had the chair role. So for me, it's about glass ceilings within glass ceilings. Why is this? Why is it that we are not getting more women into chair roles and SID roles, these big influential roles, when clearly there are a number of women who've had significant experience sitting on boards? So I'm going to leave that there on the progress, because I want to really make some points about targets, because I think, as I said, in this country, we have really taken the whole topic of doing voluntary targets very seriously. And I think it's interesting, I made this point that 10 years ago, we felt that there was a binary choice. Either you go for a quota or you go for a target, but targets were somehow soft. I now see it quite differently. It's really a spectrum. Some countries that have had quotas have been pretty soft quotas, and some countries, and in particular our country, have actually taken targets very seriously. So when you really get targets that are quite hard driven, both by the government, investors, and corporate governance guidelines, I think you really have targets that can make a big difference. So I just want to, in my remaining few minutes, talk about what we found out when my co-researcher and myself talked to a number of organisations. They weren't all professional service firms, but several of them were, plus other organisations from across different sectors. And I just want to really report on the main findings that came out. I mean, the first one is that most of the organisations, in fact, all these organisations had adopted voluntary targets for gender because previous diversity initiatives simply hadn't worked. And I think you heard from Fiona Hawthorne back in November, those of you who joined that particular session with Richard, and she talked about very enthusiastically about why initiatives didn't work, about improving the number of women in leadership. She talked about actually unconscious bias. I personally prefer to say it's not unconscious bias, it's actually what Margaret Heffenhofer refers to as willful blindness. If you actually look at your stats, if you all look at your pipelines, as I've said earlier, at the entry levels, at the graduate entry levels, actually companies and firms are doing pretty good, pretty well on representation of women. It's just that the women disappear as you go up that pipeline. And then if you add in race and ethnicity, well, that actually compounds it even further, as we know. So all these organizations had introduced targets. And I do want to make this point because it comes up so frequently in conversations I have. Diversity does not compromise meritocracy. Let's all be honest with ourselves. We like to think our organizations are based on meritocratic grounds. They're not. If you actually just look at the numbers who get promoted through, something's going wrong with our system. And what we've actually found, and what these organizations have found, is actually where you do introduce targets, they actually really enable much greater fairness and meritocracy. Two features of targets that do prompt lots of discussion is how ambitious they should be and accountability. And those are both quite thorny issues. I'd be interested to see if members of the audience want to pick that up. Ambitiousness, I mean, often we found the organisations just actually picked up the targets set by Davis or by Hampton-Alexander. So looking at 30 to 40% women in senior leadership roles now. But actually, some of the organisations said, it's not a bad idea to have a really ambitious target. Even if you don't make it, it really does mobilise you into action. Everyone, incidentally, agreed that the whole issue on ethnicity and race is much, much challenging, and we're probably 10 years behind gender on this. In terms of accountability, there was considerable variance around this. A number of organisations like to enforce their targets with a concerted effort to tie targets to leadership performance. But, you know, there's a lot more concern and ambivalence about how to do this. I think there's also a concern about how you actually cascade targets down. And clearly, my last point here, targets were seen as a real tool for culture change, where firms and organizations take targets very seriously. Then what this means is that they really scrutinize and unroot bias across their key talent management processes, such as selection, performance management, promotions, talent management. Bringing in targets fosters a much more data-driven approach to people decisions and a more systematic focus on inclusion. So I think there's a compelling reason for actually having targets. Now, I know Richard actually advertised his awards at the beginning of this morning, and I want to say, as one of the judges in the diversity inclusion, anyone listening who actually feels that they've really made great progress with targets, it will be great to hear from you, and please enter. I've actually just skimmed through all of this, but if any of you are interested in the details, please go onto the Cranfield University website and just look up the Female FTSE Women on Boards Report 2020, and you can get all the details. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Sue. Wow, whistle-top tour, but as you say, really interesting. And congratulations, by the way. I think all of us on the audience and some questions coming in. You know, things don't happen without somebody pushing, as they say. And I can see that you've been a very strong force for change. And Francesca joined us as possibly one of the people who have made it to these executive director roles, which is awesome. So tell us a little bit about your journey, maybe, and your thoughts on what you've heard from Sue.
Sure, no, happy to pick up that, and thank you, Sue, for all the work you've done on this, because I think people like myself would benefit immensely from that change, and that change in view and change in approach. And the big piece for me has always been around diversity of thinking. If everybody looks the same, sounds the same, talks the same, you're less effective as a business. You're not able to see a bigger picture, and you end to keep on reproducing the same old results over and over again. So always powerful. And I must have, when I started off in my career like 50 billion years ago, I thought targets were a terrible idea. I was going, no, I want to get there because I deserve to get there, and I'll be better than everybody else, make sure I do it. And then as I got a bit older and wiser, I went, actually, without targets, you don't really shift anything at all. So I'm a big fan of them these days, because sometimes without that target, it's very easy to find reasons not to make a difference. I just want to perhaps expand out some of the changes that are happening around women in those higher senior roles, because we do an annual survey of women in the mid-market. So that's obviously one of the engine houses of economies around the world. And we've been tracking for about 15, 16 years. How many people are getting onto a board who are female? It's hard to get the data for broader diversity, but gender data is a little bit easier to do. And we do a survey of people in all different countries, right in about 60, 70 different countries around the world. And it has been an interesting shift. For ages, that dynamic at the senior board level stagnated around 20%. And it shifted a little bit up and then shifted a little bit back, but didn't really hit the heady heights of the 30%. And we've just done the latest report. I think we launched it around February time for International Women's Day. But what is intriguing to see is just gone over 30%. That's a global stat, not an individual country stat. But that's fascinating to see that shift. And I think something that Fiona spoke to last year was these things take time. But if you don't get the foundations in place, it will never change. So you may not see the end result coming through for years, but you absolutely have to start at the grassroots, make sure you've got the right pool, make sure you're doing the right things. And then it may take a little bit of time. But the other thing that's been intriguing is that women in senior roles, it's not always the same role anymore. I mean, it's a vast generalization. When you saw a woman on a board, they tend to be head of HR or head of a function role, and you're seeing far more senior women coming in who are in a broader range of roles. It could be the finance officer, it could be the CEO, it could be any of the board roles. And there's something there around that spread, which I think is really encouraging. And then there's a great question that came through about how do you actually shift the dial in professional services firms? And I know we're not renowned for our fantastic embracement of modern thinking always. We can get very old-fashioned, we can be quite limited in our approaches, but all the same things that you're seeing in corporates, that really intentional change, that why haven't we got women coming through to senior roles? Is it because we're losing them at some stage? Is it because we're not giving them the opportunities? So many different elements of that. And it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts on that. But my sort of general sense is that there is so many different areas where we just don't provide the right seeding to help women get through to those top roles.
Yes, well, let me pick that up actually, Francesca, about how do women do in professional service firms at partner level. I mean, some years ago, there's quite a difference. I mean, actually, women in audit do quite well. I think it's sort of 1 in 3. In law firms around 10 years ago, it was really poor. And there was a big McKinsey report that was done in conjunction with the 30% Club. And it showed that for every 12 men who get promoted to partner, 1 woman does. So I mean, it was really shone a big spotlight on it. And to be fair, law firms, the major law firms, and we've worked with some of them, have really come together and put a lot of effort in. And I perhaps should say, because I don't think it's any secret, it was EY who sponsored our report in September, because they have done put a tremendous amount of energy into targets and actually have the most amazing ambition for 40% women partners in their UK business. So good for them. Actually, I've seen some fantastic work going in professional service firms. So another plaudit to kind of Richard and the whole sector. I see a lot of advancement going on in this sector. So it's really great to see.
Thanks. Let's just bring Francesca. Do you have any thoughts on Pete's views in terms of just switching back to that area, in terms of what your firm might be thinking about in terms of how we're going to create a safe place, if you like, for people to re-engage? I can't believe that's not on the agenda.
Oh, that's so on the agenda. I imagine everybody on this call's got that on the agenda. And Peter, I love that the whole pivot point that you made. I mean, how many people started something at the beginning of 2020 only to see it crumble into dust and then pick themselves up and create something great? God, all credit to you for that. Maybe I can slightly shift it into that whole psychological safety point, which is I know a term that's been around since the 90s. The work that was done by the Harvard Business Review professors around that has been really powerful. But creating a psychological safety, which is a huge topic, and that is taking in place physical safety, mental safety, but also that just sense that you're able to speak out and talk about the things that matter to you. I think if anything that you can take from the last 9-10 months is how much more important that's even become. Because if you don't physically see somebody, you're just chatting to them over Zoom or Teams or whatever system you use. You don't always pick up the nuances. You don't always see what's going on. You don't always have that insight as to what's happening. And if people don't feel uncomfortable sharing some of those things, that can create all sorts of problems. And I think there's a lovely link there also around people's general health and wellness. I've seen some great things happening in Alpha, but in lots of firms where people have been trying to create a bit more passion around looking after yourself. And it could be something as simple as everyone collectively getting together and doing a walk, which you can do in your own time, but you put it onto an app and you can walk around the UK virtually. I've seen lots of ways of people trying to connect in a different way, which is all about physical and mental well-being. But for me, the big one is mental health. I think a lot of people have struggled with the isolation or the different type of connectivity, and it's fascinating to see how the thinking has progressed in that.
I can tell you from a sorry, Richard. I can tell you from a personal point of view. Having 3 children at home, I think it is possible to work from home. It is possible to teach from home. It is not possible to do both at the same time. So, if there was an office open near me, I think I'd probably be jumping in there, skipping. Look, I think that thing about kind of making people feel emotionally safe, it's somewhat intangible, but I think it's really important because we have spent 9 months, whether or not we've been back into the office for a couple of weeks and then Boris told us to work from home again, or we've just been 100% working from home. We've been in our cocoons. We know what we're doing from a day-to-day basis. We know that we're safe. We know that we've done, or we know that we don't really believe what's going on and we've been cracking on and doing what we want to do. The problem we've got when people come back together into a shared space is actually they don't know what the person next to them has been doing, or they don't know whether or not they've been looking after themselves, whether they've been self-isolating, whether they're taking it seriously. So I think something that technology can do is give you that border, that the baseline that just says, look, actually, when you're going to come back into this space, and we know that some days you're going to be working from home, we know that some days you'll be coming into the office, but when we do come back in, we know that you've all ticked the same boxes, and that gives a real level of reassurance. It's not in professional services, but we're dealing with a telecoms company. They've actually been probably 65% working from the office, and again, they've got those stats because the system gives them that. But 65% of people are working from the office, and the stories they were giving us about their employees really, really worried about whether or not they should be. Everybody's got an elderly relative or somebody in their sphere of influence that could be effective, and the fact that there was something there just to provide them with some reassurance really allowed them to get back in.
Fantastic. Well, we're sort of almost sadly at the end of this little show for this week. I mean, do you have any final thoughts, Sue, before we head
I was actually just going to add another point to Pete. What particularly strikes me as being really, really helpful with his system is the checking in with individuals, because what's most struck me is our work group gets together twice a week. And, when everyone's there, you can get a sense of, the norm is everyone's happy and we share war stories, but basically we're all getting along. But actually, when you get a chance to talk to people one-to-one, it's really quite different across the group. And I like Pete's point about checking in with people individually on a regular basis.
Thanks. Any final thoughts, Francesca, or for this week?
There's some great stuff in there, wasn't there? Richard, I don't know how you managed to get everyone together. It's always so impressive. Big takeaways for me were around that real acknowledgement about what you need to do to keep your people safe, but also about what you need to do intentionally around dual diversity issues as well. So some great insight.
Fantastic. Well, I've said we've come to that point now where I'm going to have to thank our wonderful panel. Thank Sue, thank Pete, and obviously
Pleasure.
Francesca. We have next week, quite interesting. We've got Jeremy's back. You'll be pleased to hear Francesca. First his session, Jeremy Beard. And I've got Marcus, who's kind of talk about red team thinking. Is there always, how do you avoid groupthink? And we've got Sarah Hatton, who's actually a GP, who's coming to talk about the mental health from the GP's perspective, and she's doing some really interesting work there. So for those of you who haven't been able to make today, you'll find all the recordings in the management library. And excuse, I just need to blow that up. And we will also be, obviously, hope you found today valuable. Please encourage your peers to book for future episodes. It's great that we've got such a fantastic audience. And as we say, back next Friday. So thank you again to the panel and have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye for now.